My parents did everything they could to raise my siblings and I on a firm faith foundation. We were homeschooled through high school, attended Mass daily, and prayed together as a family, read spiritual classics, spent copious amounts of time at our diocesan Catholic retreat center for spiritual direction and days of recollection, and had numerous special traditions based on the liturgical calendar that we observed throughout the year. My parents were heavily involved in Catholic marriage ministry and helped out at our parish in numerous ways, and as we girls got old enough, we joined my mom in providing music for Mass. Our Catholic faith was of the utmost importance, and we thoroughly enjoyed the richness it brought to our family life. Certainly, we encountered liturgical abuses of various kinds, but my parents educated my siblings and me in authentic church teaching and disciplinary directives, so we would recognize aberrations on the spot and discuss them as such later on. We knew things weren't perfect, but we knew that our job was to be faithful no matter what, and made the most of what we had. I never felt like anything was missing from my life as a Catholic. Our family had known only the Novus Ordo until I was 16, and at the time one did have to hunt around a bit to find a church where the priest was well-formed and celebrated the Mass with reverence. We had done so, and now drove beyond 3 other Catholic churches to attend a diocesan parish where the priest was solidly Orthodox and the community was devout. Besides varying degrees of poor music and other people's rambunctious kids, we had nothing to complain about regarding our Mass-going experience. At this parish, we made a friend who introduced us to his longtime pal, a priest in the FSSP. We first made Father's acquaintance through listening to his sermons on CD. That was like a revelation to me, and I became a total groupie. I ate up everything and talked about it all the time. When our friend said that he would be hosting Father one weekend and invited my family to come and meet him, we were all excited. We could ask him any question we wanted, and he had an answer. My parents had catechized as well, yet here was so much we hadn't encountered, including the old rite of Mass. Meeting Father made us decide to seek out a diocesan indult Mass 3 hours away and pilgrimage there to see what it was all about. Coming out of that first old rite Mass felt so strange, like I hadn't even been to Mass. "Do you think that really fulfilled our obligation?" I asked my dad. "I guess so," he replied, shaking his head. I found it hard to follow, so different from what I was used to. Our heads bobbed up and down from the missalette to the priest as we tried to figure out why we couldn't hear him half the time, but we weren't the kind to give up easily. We came back once a month and studied a little in order to better understand what was going on. After a while, the strangeness wore off, and I decided the old rite was where things were at. Undoubtedly, the novelty of it was partly responsible for this shift in my thinking. One thing I really came away with was the importance of reverence and how celebrating Mass ad orientem made it so obvious that the priest was intervening on our behalf, not just hosting a prayer meeting. It impressed upon me the dignity of the priesthood and increased my appreciation and respect for our clergy and their role as our shepherds. Those experiences gave proper context to the form of Mass with which I was already familiar, so I could take that understanding back to the Novus Ordo and continue to be enriched. Now that I was familiar with the old rite, I realized why reading the lives of the saints had always been a little confusing when referring to their experiences during Mass. They spoke of its parts in terms I hadn't understood until now. I began to feel indignant that I had been somehow robbed of my spiritual patrimony that had belonged to nearly all the saints until now. The Reformed order of Mass was still so new in the life of the Church, and most priests did not understand how to offer it correctly. Seminaries were struggling to turn out well-formed priests, and priests were struggling to keep their parishioners happy and still do what was right according to the knowledge they did have. What a mess, I thought. We just needed to go back to this. I lost interest in the Novus Ordo and tolerated it as all that was available except for that one Sunday a month when we could dive into another experience. That same year, one of our parish musicians went away for a sacred music intensive. When he returned, this fellow formed a schola cantorum and taught us to read and sing Gregorian chant. I honestly didn't like it at first. It was so cerebral and plain, but my mom and middle sister were crazy about it, so I dragged along behind with my oldest sister, learning and singing just to give it a chance. Eventually, our director moved out of state, and the large schola consequently disbanded. We didn't want to give it all up, however, and so my mom and sisters and I maintained a once-a-month slot on the parish music schedule and sang Gregorian chant along with the best hymns in 4 parts we could find. Soon we became established as the choir for the monthly Old Rite Mass, and we would spend a few hours afterward schmoozing with all the other pilgrims who had driven far to be there and soak up some Latin-speaking atmosphere. Our celebrant was a retired priest who blew about 40 years of dust off of his 1962 missal in order to be able to offer the old rite for us once a month. He was the humble, cheerful servant of the church who was willing to do whatever was asked of him, despite his creaking bones. I met some other lovely folks, most of whom regularly attended Novus Ordo parishes. These were the same kind of strong, faithful, open-hearted people I was accustomed to meet in my frequenting of diocesan parishes. There were occasional grumblings about the bishop and why he did or didn't do this or that, but mostly our talk was elevating and revolved around our life experiences and the rudiments of the faith. These people were simply taking in another Catholic experience and letting it enrich them. They were happy to be there and happy to be Catholic. There were two families I got to know who didn't fully fit the description above. We shall call them the Smiths and the Jones. About these two families there was an urgent, conspiratorial energy that gave one a sort of thrill to encounter, but which it was a relief to get away from after a while. Interaction with them was civil enough, even enjoyable, but there was present an undercurrent of tension, almost as if they were on the run from something, especially in the case of Mr. Smith. He was a warrior who bore constant anxiety about the state of the church. I never saw him relaxed. The Smiths bounced between every old rite mass they could find, a distant SSPX chapel, and reluctant attendance at a Novus Ordo when no other options were available. Then there was the Jones family. The furtive quality hung somewhat about the mother and daughters, but about Mr. Jones there was merely an edge of determined prejudice. He was friendly enough, but his seeming calm betokened a coiled spring ready to pop if the right topic button were pressed, namely the Novus Ordo liturgy. His family attended regularly the nearest SSPX chapel and filled in with FSSP or diocesan indult masses whenever possible. On the off weekends, they stayed at home and prayed the rosary, judging it better to skip Mass than to expose their children to the inherent evils of the Reformed liturgy. This was just a sampling of what I was to encounter down the road as I mixed more with traditionalists. For the time being, I was happy listening to FSSP priests' homilies, singing Gregorian chant, wearing veils in church, militantly observing modesty guidelines, and morphing into a liturgy snob. Reading church documents on sacred music and liturgical rubrics, I became a nut for the rules. The motto, "Do the red, say the black," seemed to be all that was necessary to make sure we were on the right track. Why can't people just do things by the book? I wondered. Soon I asked Father X to be my spiritual director. Father put me in touch with a wonderful religious community who, in conjunction with him, helped me to discern my vocation, for which I will always be grateful. He introduced me to the rudiments and importance of mental prayer, St. Louis de Montfort's total consecration to Mary, the confraternity of the Holy Rosary, to make your rosaries nuclear-powered, as he said, and St. Ignatius' rules for discernment, to name a few. He pointed out the moral dangers of things like organ donation, encouraged us to study the lives of the saints, and shared with my family many more helpful moral lessons and fascinating historical facts about our amazing Catholic faith. Father was devout, exceptionally intelligent, and well-read, and I was so impressed by him that for the first time in my life I slipped into an attitude of clericalism, at least when it came to the counsels of Father X. Now that he was my spiritual director, I had to obey him in matters of my soul, and besides that, who was I to question such an educated man who taught with such authority, and who our family friend, that we also respected, looked up to so much and questioned on no point whatsoever? I would certainly be a presumptuous little goon to do so. Father X's word became law, and I quoted him ad nauseum to anyone with whom I entered into a spiritual conversation. Father X's formation in traditionalism and the seeds of suspicion it had sown in him bore fruit over time in me as well, formed though I had been in the mainstream Catholic Church. While he helped me in many ways, Father also whittled away at my confidence in certain things I had previously benefited from. For instance, a few years previously, my family had attended a few Catholic charismatic conferences in our diocese. Our bishop opened the conference with a teaching, and always there were excellent priests presenting and hearing confessions. The attendees were fervent and enthusiastic. Some even received the gift of healing. There were people speaking in tongues, much praise was offered to God, and nothing remotely frenzied or disturbing ever occurred. We came away edified and better instructed in our faith, and were grateful for the experience. However, when the charismatic movement came up while talking to Father X, he was completely disapproving. When we asked why, he just told us to watch the documentary entitled Marjo, which followed the story of a Protestant worship leader who feigned receiving the gifts of the Holy Spirit in order to dupe people through the frenzied revival meetings he held and thereby make his living. I was a little puzzled at this pat answer to my question, since it seemed completely unrelated to my own experience, but felt I must always abide by whatever Father X said. One day we were discussing the Catechism of the Catholic Church promulgated by Pope St. John Paul II in 1992. Father X astounded us by declaring, "Oh, there's error in the Catechism." When we asked him what kinds of errors, he replied, "For one thing, it says nothing outright about the doctrine of the limbo of the innocents." I don't actually recall any other concrete objections that he could make to the integrity of the Catechism. But Father X averred that Article 1261 of the Catechism should have explicitly taught that children who die without baptism spend their eternity deprived of the beatific vision, but in a state of perfect natural happiness. I accepted this on Father's word and wondered to myself for having been so believing as to swallow every word of the Catechism, which we had previously studied from beginning to end as a family, and not even bothered to think it might be erroneous and unreliable. Maybe I had better leave the Catechism alone for now, or only reference it regarding things I am already sure about, I thought. Footnote. Incidentally, as I later discovered, the Church has never taught limbo as a definitive doctrine or dogma, but as theological speculation about which the fathers and doctors of the Church have held differing opinions. Article 1261 of the Catechism actually said, quote, "As regards children who have died without baptism, the Church can only entrust them to the mercy of God, as she does in her funeral rites for them. Indeed, the great mercy of God who desires that all men should be saved, and Jesus' tenderness toward children, which caused him to say, 'Let the children come to me, do not hinder them,' allow us to hope that there is a way of salvation for children who have died without baptism, all the more urgent as the Church's call not to prevent little children coming to Christ through the gift of holy baptism." Unquote. Far from stating error or denying or subverting the importance of baptism, the Church is stating that we cannot be certain of the destiny of unbaptized children, this having not been explicitly revealed. But in Article 1257, it very rightly adds, quote, "The Church does not know of any means other than baptism that assures entry into eternal beatitude. This is why she takes care not to neglect the mission she has received from the Lord to see that all who can be baptized are reborn of water and the Spirit. God has bound salvation to the sacrament of baptism, but he himself is not bound by his sacraments." Unquote. End of footnote. Other things were brought into question while talking to Father, such as the prudence of certain teachings of the Second Vatican Council and its nature as, quote, "pastoral," unquote, rather than, quote, "dogmatic," unquote, meaning that it could safely be ignored since it was non-essential teaching and controversial besides. There were also issues with the Novus Ordo, which were irreparable, he said. There was, according to him, no way it could be celebrated properly. The Reformed sacraments, such as the rite of baptism, were now impoverished and less effective at protecting souls from the influence of the devil, which explained the rise in cases of demonic possession. John Paul II's theology of the body was also to be avoided like the plague. Father said that teaching was nothing new in the Church, and therefore not worth the fuss that had been made about it. He also considered it scandalous that couples preparing for marriage were often subjected to lecture courses in theology of the body, and that it posed an unnecessary occasion of sin for them to be exposed to such materials before marriage. Father's own method of marriage preparation related to sexual relations included a packet of information which he gave the groom following the wedding ceremony, telling him to read it after the honeymoon was over. He deplored that the Pope had the painted-over loincloths removed from the figures of the Sistine Chapel, and thus rendered the sacred art so immodest, as Michelangelo had originally intended, apparently. On it went, and as his opinions flowed, I conformed myself to them and went on my way. I found a certain security in Father X's approach, and in being able to submit any matter to him and rely on his judgment. I was enjoying binky Catholicism with all its accoutrements, and thought we finally had it made, at least as long as we had access to Father X. As the years went by, I started to meet various people who attended the nearby SSPX chapel, mostly through a book club I was part of. There I discovered a whole new level of tension and prejudice. As long as you were on subjects about which everyone agreed, especially lamenting the sad state of affairs regarding the moral degradation of society, things went swimmingly. We cracked jokes and muscled through various topics with a delightful vengeance. But on one occasion, someone had the audacity to bring up variances in liturgy and the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. This produced a fight, the likes of which I had never seen, and the SSPX proponent on my side of the room became livid, standing and shouting down his opponent, hurling judgments against sainted popes and bitter criticism of the magisterial acts of the Church, I was reminded of a demonic manifestation I had been proximate to several years before. Here was the spirit of schism unveiled before my eyes, tearing us apart, one so-called Catholic from another, ultimately calling into question everything about the Church. Gone was trust in and docility towards our Holy Father and Mother. Here was raw, willful, disordered attachment, lashing out at anything that threatened it, stumbling to justify its dissent, and the contempt in which it held those who stood in its way. Meanwhile, the man being shouted at remained calm and reasonable throughout. He had all the arguments on his side, the side of truth, and he also had something in his heart that the other man lacked so lamentably: peace. I will never forget that night. It helped shock me out of the attitudes into which I had been sliding and made me examine the traditionalists I knew more carefully. All my life in the Novus Ordo, I had known joy-filled, peaceful men and women of simple faith who clung to the truth and endured difficulties bravely, edifying their acquaintance and loving God with abandon. I had always known people like this and continued to meet more of them on a regular basis in my frequenting of our diocesan churches and retreat house. The trads I met, like my friends from the Society Chapel or the Indult Masses, were pleasant, better read than most, serious about their faith, some quite generous, and often fun to be around. But there was always lacking those qualities of peace of soul, unmitigated charity, and profound joy. Why were the fruits of the Spirit so evident where I came from, and so mysteriously lacking where I was heading? Shouldn't it be the other way around? According to the traditionalist narrative, the answer should have been a resounding yes. "By their fruits you shall know them," is one quotation that my old right groupie friends loved to give an airing to again and again. Father X said to us once, "Your family is proof that the Novus Ordo works. It's just harder." Was it indeed, I now began to wonder? Harder in what way? According to Father X, we were operating under anemic sacramental rites and forms, at a clear disadvantage to our trad brothers and sisters. My head knowledge of the faith had grown during my time in tradland, but my heart was getting colder, my snobbery more pronounced, and I now had distaste for things that once fed my soul. I came across a blog article online by a lady in similar circumstances to myself, recounting how she had been given the eyes to understand her ingratitude for the gifts of God. Reading her words, I began to understand myself. Not everything was perfect about my growing up and the liturgies or catechesis programs I was exposed to, but the fruit that my experiences bore was ultimately very good. I had been nourished and made stronger, and then I pooh-poohed the good gifts of God. I had made it my job to determine what was better, then looked down on the rest. But the Church had not done so, nor did it encourage the faithful to. In my desire to be the most Catholic, I had actually become un-Catholic, judging and assigning values to things that I had not been asked to, things the Church offered as legitimate options, not graded as better or worse. At least I had the benefit of both experiences to be able to compare them. If I had been raised traditionalist, I don't know that I ever would have made it out. The Church I had known growing up had fostered in me moderation, earnestness, a love of the good, and a patient kindness toward others. While I was becoming more trad, my sensitivity to the incorrect grew to be almost unbearable. For instance, being out in public surrounded by women in various states of undress or hearing people swear deeply distressed me. At the time, I counted it as a sign of growth that I could be so profoundly disturbed by what was improper. At Mass, if hymns were being sung that I deemed unworthy of the liturgy, I boycotted them by remaining silent and subjected priests celebrating the Novus Ordo to dire scrutiny. Was that an improvisation there? I thought he said one word differently from the Missal. I would have to check when I got home. I preferred the host to be elevated higher, and felt the priests who did so were the more devout. My preferences were ridiculous. For years, on the way home from Mass, I would bewail the imperfections of my liturgical experience, or the poor behavior of the children sitting near me. I had a hard time bearing with the faults of others, especially when their opinions differed from mine. When St. Paul said, "Be patient with the scruples of those whose faith is weak," he was talking about people like me. Traditionalism has its good points, and many things it seeks to preserve have great value, but overall it is a religious system designed for those whose faith is weak. I know from experience. Now when I'm confronted by something like immodest dress, I calmly take note of it, but then reflect how many people don't intend to do harm and are ignorant of the effect their dress can have. Many are trying to do their best with what knowledge and resources they have. I try to give them grace and remember that I continually make mistakes. Our Lord railed bitterly against the Pharisees, but he treated adulterers and tax collectors with gentle kindness. When I fail to do as he did, I become the worst sinner, the self-righteous Pharisee who has all their externals in place and a heart full of decay. I continue to discover traditudes accumulated along the way regarding various things. When I think I've finally shaken off the disorder, it comes back to haunt me in another form. One thing that saved me was the example of my parents and other holy souls of my acquaintance. My parents were discerning, not narrow-minded, eager to learn, willing to admit when they were wrong, and they looked for the good in everything. They expected to find goodness and profited by it even when it came from surprising places. Mom and Papa taught me to take responsibility for my faith formation and actions. They also exemplified productive service and taught us we should do our part to make things better. If the catechesis program at your parish is pathetic, offer to teach and supply resources to improve it. If the music at Mass is poor, educate yourself as to how it should be and offer your gifts accordingly. If the sanctuary appointments are lacking, suggest and provide worthy ones. My parents were not proponents of taking the easy way out or looking for a package deal that's done for you. There have been times when the efforts we made were rejected, or when more time was needed to realize improvements, but including schooling us in patience and humility, the results were worth all the trouble we took. Being a Catholic today is a lot of work, but we have all the help we need. So what if the most difficult path lies in helping to realize the vision of the Church regarding evangelization, theology, liturgy, and so on? It is an honor to be called to take part in furthering the kingdom of God. Our clergy are so often at a disadvantage, undereducated in some cases, or overworked and lacking the luxury of much time to devote to further study or problem solving. My family befriended and encouraged our pastors, found ways to help, brainstormed, and did research for them. It was a collaborative effort for which they were grateful. It yielded much fruit and forged grace-filled, meaningful relationships. I learned we aren't given our faith to be like jam jars on a shelf, focusing only on preservation and avoiding contaminants. We are mixing in a world of all kinds, yeast and dough, but the immune system of grace and a life of prayer will fortify and lead us aright if we trust God and act boldly. I continue to study the faith, praying to have an open heart that allows the Holy Spirit to direct my path towards God. My zeal for obedience and living out an authentic expression of our Catholic beliefs and traditions has not waned since putting traditionalism behind me. I'm amazed by how much there is yet to learn, and by how much happier and more peaceful my heart has grown. I pray that everyone who loves what is good will someday be fully united and working together for the best good of our Mother, the Church. Despite scandals, doubts, and fears, may God lead us safely into the fulfillment of His perfect will. Quote, "And I have given them the glory you gave me, so that they may be one as we are one, I in them, and you in me, that they may be brought to perfection as one, that the world may know that you sent me, and that you loved them even as you loved me." Unquote. John chapter 17, verses 22 through 23.